everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brandy Brewer, and I am a doctoral student at the University of Louisville. Today, I'm joined by Oscar Hughes, and we are going to talk on behalf of the Council for Exceptional Children's Teacher Education Diversity Caucus. So Oscar is a PhD student in special education at Boston University. Oscar is also working part-time supporting the Rainbow support groups for LGBTQ plus self-advocates at Massachusetts Advocates, Standing Strong, correct? In that work, Oscar believes that the needs and priorities that are expressed by people with disabilities should be central to the supports and services, and also the research that's done in disability and education. Especially, he's concerned with promoting access to self-determination for students and adults with IDD, so that they can have choice and control in their own lives and experience life to its full potential. So thank you, Oscar, for joining us today. I know that your time is super valuable. We were just talking about what time means as being doctoral students. So let's go ahead and get right into talking about the research that you've done in the past, kind of what you plan to do next, and some of the exciting things that are happening in the field that are of particular interest to you.
Great.
How are you doing, first of all?
Yeah, wonderful. I'm finishing up my third year as a PhD student, and I just heard that my dissertation proposal was approved, and I'm very excited about the project. There's a lot of energy. I'm collaborating with a lot of people on it who are really excited to get started. So just really happy to be in this work and to share it in any way that I can. So thank you for the invite.
Yeah, we're really fortunate to have folks like you doing this sort of work. Okay, so tell us, you've told us about where you are within your research, but if you want, can you tell us a little bit more about the focus of your research? So your dissertation proposal was just approved last night, you said, so congratulations on that. So let's dive in a little bit deeper into your role, I think, in the community at Boston University, and also, the focus of your current research.
Yeah, so as a special education teacher, I was teaching health, and I got involved in updating some sexuality education curriculum to be more trans inclusive, using more inclusive language and including more information about trans identities and experiences. And through that, I got connected to Pauline Bosma and the Rainbow support groups here in Massachusetts, and I started supporting some of their work. And then Pauline and the Rainbow groups were really interested in what kinds of resources and supports would help LGBTQ plus folks with IDD to express themselves and experience more quality of life and fulfillment. And so we kind of work together on this research project. So my dissertation project is really a research collaboration with LGBTQ plus adults with IDD to design resources so that they can experience higher quality of life and express their gender and their sexuality.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So are you finding in these conversations that you're having, what I am gathering that you're talking about is really these folks really pulling from their own experiences and talking about ways to improve access for people that are in the same situation or position that they're in? Is that what kind of where we're aiming for this?
Yeah, so if we look to the peer-reviewed literature, there are a lot of gaps in terms of understanding the experiences of LGBTQ plus folks with IDD, but there are a lot of folks in that community who are out there, engaging in advocacy work. There's the Rainbow groups here in Massachusetts who of folks supporting one another, and we hear about a lot of struggles that people are going through, and often, people don't have the support and the opportunity to express their gender and their sexuality As a teacher, I saw myself that students with disabilities were really restricted in their opportunities to, have self-determination when expressing their gender and learning about and expressing their sexuality. So I think there's a lot of community cultural knowledge, but there's a lot of ongoing struggles. And so I'm hoping that, the research community can, support and advocate alongside self-advocates as they're doing this work to promote access, to be more self-determined and express themselves. So I hope that I can, promote that work that's ongoing. And
Yeah. So that leads us kind of into our second question, right? So we're talking about frameworks or research methods that are going to particularly be key in addressing some of these issues of inclusion and equity with the LGBTQ plus community. So we've already talked about self-determination strategies and utilizing those within research. Can you think of some other key components to research methods that you feel are not present and that could be more inclusive of the community?
yeah, so I'm really interested in inclusive research approaches, including participatory action research, community-based research, and, really engaging with folks, especially folks with disabilities, especially folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities who haven't always been included in the research community. Maybe they're subjects or participants, but not as co-researchers. So, how can we make the research process itself inclusive and accessible so that folks with IDD can, ask the research questions, design the research projects, and really address their priorities, not just researchers' priorities. So very interested in those inclusive approaches, and also qualitative research methods, and hearing more, I think, especially with folks who are at these intersections of these multiple historically marginalized identities, like LGBTQ plus folks with IDD, who also have other identities like cultural and racial and linguistic identities. These are really kind of people are really complex and having really unique, diverse experiences at these interactions between these identities. So I think the stories that come through and the narratives and the experiences that come through in qualitative research capture a lot of that individual complexity, which is like so meaningful and powerful. And then bringing in inclusive research to really make sure that we're supporting people in the ways that they want. I think in special education, especially professionals, researchers, and teachers, administrators have really been driving, how we support people and what kind of education people want and need. And I think we need to hear from people with disabilities, especially when, they're living with these complex intersecting identities that are just so central to, a lot of what they are experiencing in their lives.
Yeah. And that kind of touches on the next question, which is about how you see your scholarship influencing teacher education practices. And so I'm interested to know how you plan to utilize that inclusive practice within that conversation, or that obstacle, really, of getting teachers and educators and administrators to really listen to self-advocates and understand the expression there is really what needs to be paid attention to.
Yeah, that's such a difficult question. If a lot of this feels like cultural change and really changing mindsets, and how to do that is pretty abstract. But most of my work in this dissertation project is with adults with IDD. But there's a lot of, I think, value in learning from people's past school experiences, and especially young adults who have recently transitioned out of schools, and what is it that was supportive to them, those teachers who were there for them, or who they did feel were able to support them and teach them things that they needed to know now as adults, I think is really meaningful in preparing teachers to work with LGBTQ plus students with disabilities. And also, honestly, a lot of it is looking back at schools as a LGBTQ plus person with IDD. We're hearing a lot in our interviews, which are ongoing, that there's a lot of trauma there. There's a lot of hardship, the bullying, the rejection, the misunderstanding that students in this community endure, for their many different identities, and has really been really challenging and traumatic for a lot of people who experience, that bullying, that rejection, that misunderstanding. So I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of thinking about, creating accessible and inclusive schools, and really valuing difference, and even just seeing the possibility. I think we limit our students with disabilities, our students with IDD especially, in terms of their gender and sexual expression. So how can we, expand possibilities and support them so that they can determine for themselves, who they are and how they want to live their lives. So I hope that we can, the project we're working on is to create a guidebook for professionals, which would be all about the stories and experiences of LGBTQ plus people with IDD. What are the supports that they're looking for, and how, what type of sexuality education would be beneficial to them. So we're hoping that, special education teachers are a major audience for that guidebook that we're working on. And we're also creating some materials, educational materials about, what is gender, what is sexuality, and making those visual and accessible to folks with IDD. So we hope that students will be able to learn from those as well, and just getting those out there as much as we can.
Yeah. So, in talking really about the challenges of studying diverse and equitably challenged, is that a term that I just coined? Equitably challenged conversations. Obviously, the folks that you are working with have, as you said, faced many challenges as a result of their intersectionalities. And I wonder, so this next question is kind of twofold, right? I wonder, first, if you can address if you have had any difficulties in accessing this population, because of kind of issues with surrounding being out, or the safety thereof. And then on the back end, I'd like for you to talk about, in your manuscript supporting gender self-determination for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, you talk a little bit about this idea that caregivers are not always, are either, they kind of fall into two categories, right? They're either not very equipped at dealing with this, or they're overly protective, which I think that overprotection piece we see sometimes generally in the disability community from caregivers, as kind of a general scope. So again, if you could just address any issues with accessing this population, and then also on the back end, how you see your work really helping. We've talked about how it will help teachers and educators, but if you could talk a little bit about how it might help to influence that caregiver relationship as well.
Yeah. Thank you for asking about all of these things. These are all kind of ongoing questions for us. I'll speak about recruiting first. So we're interviewing LGBTQ plus adults with IDD from across the country. luckily, because this is such a community-based project, we were able to reach a lot of folks through our kind of community network and connections. But it has been difficult to find, you know, a lot of the participants, for example, have been either in the Northeast, the West Coast, major cities, and we know that there are a lot of people out there who, you know, maybe would identify as LGBTQ plus if they knew about that, but haven't even heard about that, or haven't had the support and education to discover what their gender and sexual identity is. So I do think that there are a lot of people out there who, you know, would do or would embrace an LGBTQ plus identity if they had the support and the education to do so. So and those are folks who are maybe feeling the most isolated or lost. And so that has been difficult, I think, to reach a really regionally diverse group of folks. Also because a lot of folks with IDD, especially those with significant support needs, have supporters who monitor their communication or their computer use. I can imagine that there are folks who are not out who, it would risk outing them to certain people if they replied to the email or played the YouTube video about the study and reached out to do the interview. Also, just in general, limited access to internet. We know folks in congregate care and group homes, we here have very limited access to maybe the one computer at the group home, and if they're very heavily supervised. So there's a lot of reasons why I think folks in this community who may want to participate in the research haven't heard about it or haven't been able to respond. And so, I think in a lot of ways, folks who may be in need of the most support or who are maybe struggling the most weren't able to share their stories and experiences in this study. We were really fortunate at Boston University, at Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. The IRB was really worked with me and was really essentially, I was concerned that if participants needed to have their court-appointed guardian provide consent for them to participate in the study, that folks who had a court-appointed guardian that was either unsupportive or unaware of their LGBTQ plus identity would be a major barrier to their participation. And we were able to work with the IRB to find ways to for participants to give informed consent, regardless of whether or not they had a court-appointed guardian. There were other ways to show that the person was informed about the study and could decide for themselves. In situations where they didn't feel like their court-appointed guardian could or should know about the nature of the study. So they were really open to, I think not taking a deficit view of people with IDD and really seeing, the potential for someone to understand and consent to participation, regardless of that guardianship. In terms of other challenges in the research, I think that I've been thinking a lot about some of the legal constraints that folks face in certain states. So, where I talked about this guidebook that we're working on, and it's really hard to use a guidebook to support LGBTQ plus students when you can't even talk about LGBTQ plus issues, or, when, one thing, visibility of LGBTQ plus mentors has been really meaningful. We've heard from a lot of research participants that when they had a staff or a teacher who was out, that was really meaningful to them to see someone else and to be able to speak to someone who could relate or share some wisdom from that shared community. So if staff and teachers feel that they can't be out or don't have legal protections to be out, there's just a ton of barriers there. I'm here in Massachusetts where I have had a lot of support and I do have a lot of legal protections to talk about these things. So how do we navigate, in different states, being able to support people and reach people when there are such these really real and legal constraints. In terms of caregivers, and you talked about in inclusive practices and I wrote about gender self-determination and how can caregivers support folks, especially with significant support needs, to have gender self-determination and avoid being overprotective. Um,
I will
this is,
say, I'll
yeah,
say that I asked that question with the caveat of being a parent, right? And so I
yeah,
know how easy it is to be overprotective
yeah,
of your kids when you sense danger, and everything that we're talking about. I would like to just make very clear this is a safety issue, right? The being out can be a safety issue. Being a participant in studies like these can be a safety issue. You talked about the IRB stuff, and that's really great that your IRB was willing to look at different avenues to allow for folks to be included, because that's a double-edged sword, right? It's a safety issue potentially to be included, but also when we talk about things like suicide rates among LGBTQ plus community, it's a safety issue to not be included at the same time. So I asked the caregiver question, knowing that it's a very
yeah,
complex question to be
yeah,
asking for anyone, let alone folks who are not usually awarded the benefit of self determination, right?
yeah. Yeah, and I don't know. These are all things that I feel really new to learning about, and I'm so grateful to all of the self advocates who are running the groups and willing to share their insights with me and experiences. But you mentioned um, I forget how you put it, but that the potential danger of not supporting someone, and I do think that's really real. Like we see in the sexuality education literature, for example, that people who don't have access to comprehensive sexuality um, are more vulnerable to abuse because they don't have the tools to know what their sexual rights are and how to advocate for those. We see this a lot with LGBTQ plus folks with IDD who, your gender and your sexual identity is so fundamental and so important to so many people that a lot of times if they don't have this support, they seek to express themselves in secret and because they have no other way. So we see, for example, that people who aren't supported to be in open same-sex relationships are engaging in them in secret, and they're doing thing they want to be in those relationships. That's really a very important part of who they are in their adult life. And so rather than having support and resources and mentors, they're out in secret, maybe feeling forced to be in relationships with people who are not respecting them, or in places where they don't have privacy or safety. So same with gender expression. People are forced to express their true fundamental gender in private or in secret, or when they're sneaking out by themselves, that they're only at greater risk of the kinds of unfortunate stigma and violence that are out there. When people have supporters, people they can go to, people they can travel with, when they have friends and mentors, when they can um, really live freely and openly in a supportive community where they have connections, meaningful connections with people who really know who they are. I think that's the best way to support people and be there for them. And I just don't. And then, of course, there's the mental health impacts of having to hide who you are, or feel ashamed of who you are, and to experience that liberation to be honest and open. The impacts on mental health are just really important too. So
Yeah. And I can't stress enough how important this research is that you're doing, and how thankful I am as a member of this community to know that this research is taking place. On that note, what advice would you have for a junior researcher who, think of that bright-eyed first year PhD student who is coming in and wants to follow along this path, what advice would you give to that person with regard to this research?
Yeah. I mean, I think centering the voices and experiences of disabled people, of people who have, these historically marginalized identities within the disability community is just like so necessary to so much of this work. I think, you know, I have a lot of my own ideas and opinions, and it's been really hard for me to put those aside and try to follow other people's lead. I think the dissertation project, especially, can be like that could be you can see that as your baby or your project or something that you really want to do. And I think if that can be true, but in community, and that you can be open to, what other people need and want, and what they've experienced, one way that I think that was possible to do that community collaboration was starting doing some of the work, not early, but I had community connections way before I knew what my dissertation project would be, because I wanted to just be a supporter and an ally. I wanted to be an advocate. And then when the time came to think of a dissertation project, research questions were already in the air, and we already had connections. I think going into an organization or a community and asking if they want to do research is really different than like having friends and co-conspirators who you already know and have connections with. So if you can make those community connections, volunteering and advocating and getting involved with local activism, things like that, those community connections can really, like, research questions can really emerge there. And then you're in a place to maybe support some of those as in your position as a student or a researcher.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Particularly, I think it's important in general, right? To have kind of those community connections, regardless of what type of research you're doing. But when the research that you're doing is as raw and vulnerable as the research that you are doing is, having those community and real relationships, I think, would be even more vital to being able to build and create something authentic. So, congratulations on on having that community around you. To
I feel so grateful. Like I feel really like welcomed and um by the rainbow support groups, and Pauline, she's been doing this work. Pauline Bosma has been working with her support groups for 18 years, and the amount of, that's, my 20 interviews will never, our 20 interviews will never compare to just the experience and the knowledge that she's gained, working with these groups for almost 20 years now. So I just feel very grateful that, folks have been so open to, working with me and collaborating in this way. Um, and yeah, I'm looking forward to the project, and I hope that, more folks will see our work and be more interested in supporting this community. So
Yeah. Um, you're really good at like these transitions into my next questions. So I appreciate that. So I want to ask you next, and you and I have kind of briefly touched on this, and your thoughts are interesting to me right now about this topic. But how do you feel like the work that you've done with TED or the Diversity Caucus or other professional organizations, how do you feel that has I'm going to say benefited or driven your research? And I'm going to say driven because I want to ask a follow-up question of that. And that is, what do you see as the role of these organizations in, and specifically things like, the TED Diversity Caucus? What do you see as the role there of groups like us in navigating the challenges of this type of research?
Yeah, you know, I heard about TED and the Diversity Caucus. I knew very little about TED and the Diversity Caucus. I'm just starting to learn about them now from you. Um, and you know, I have one professor I work with who's involved with TED, and so I'm learning a little bit just right now. But I do see, especially as a teacher and now, doing research with LGBTQ plus folks, there it there are feelings of isolation. I don't know that I've been able to connect. I would really like to connect with other LGBTQ plus teachers and researchers, um, to to connect with other folks who are working with LGBTQ plus folks with IDD, and I'm still looking for those connections, and it would be wonderful if there were more organizations supporting those kinds of connections. I'll be honest. Um, with CEC and special education broadly, I have the reputation that I've heard the reputation that, people with disabilities are not always centered in those two, in CEC and in TED, and that there's kind of this, I don't know if this is just me, but I have this feeling like
Probably not.
the advocacy organizations like I am connected with, I do follow a lot of the work of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, of CASH, and a lot of their ongoing advocacy. So I guess I would be interested to know and to see what is the advocacy work that's going on, and how, I I I like to see kind of like things changing in a day-to-day basis, that really practical work in collaboration with people making something happen. And so, I'd be interested to know like how TED and the Diversity Caucus are really engaging in that work on that level, um, and what my role could be in that, and forming connections with people who, have this research interest, which I think is, it's been really addressed, and it's pretty specific. I have a feeling there are a lot of, LGBT and queer people out there, teachers and researchers, asking questions and doing projects in this area, and feeling like they don't know anyone else who's doing that. So I would
Yeah.
like to make those connections
Yeah.
for sure.
And I think that this is a great, I would like to think that this is a great first step into that role for the Diversity Caucus. We won't say too much, but I think we have some fun things planned
Okay.
together for next year as well, kind of along these same lines. Um,
Yeah, I
so
hope people will see like my name, my email, and reach out to, if they're doing work in this area or interested or have stories or ideas, the more that we can work together on this, the better. So I hope I hear, just trying to get the name and the work out there to
yeah,
connect with as many folks as I
yeah.
can.
So I'm going to actually link your contact information
Awesome.
to the YouTube video, as well as your answers to this final question that I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
Um, it kind of reminds me of like the inside the actor studio, um, but like what is this? Um, what are what's some research and some up and coming scholars that you are particularly interested in, either having to do with your line of research, or that are related or parallel or completely not related? I want to know the inside of your brain as far as what is interesting to you right now.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I'm not sure how to answer this question. I look a lot outside of, peer-reviewed research scholarship to, all of the LGBTQ plus folks who are putting their stories and experiences out there via blogs and YouTube channels and TikToks and Twitter, all these different ways that people can, outside of traditional academia, get their stories out there and their experiences. I am really interested, actually, on my dissertation committee. Dr. Ariel Schwartz does a lot of great work with inclusive research and how to engage in collaborative research projects with youth and adults with IDD. And she's helped to create this toolkit with accessible visual plain language materials for engaging in that inclusive research that I recommend. There's a lot of work, I don't have any names, but around dignity of risk and what that looks like and what are different levels of risk and how to support people so that, they have the dignity to, be self-determined even when, there are some risks involved, and that how that's really kind of a valuable part of people's lives is, taking risks and learning from mistakes, and how people with IDD should be able to do that too. And advocacy organizations. My advisor at BU, Dr. Zachary Rossetti, is doing a lot of work around engaging parents of children with disabilities and youth with disabilities in legislative advocacy. And I've really learned a lot about that. And so talking with youth and parents about, giving legislative testimony and writing to legislators about IDEA and about other ways that, laws and policies can be changed to support students and adults with disabilities. The advocacy work and related research in connection to alternatives to guardianship, especially supported decision making, I think is really powerful. Supported decision making has so much potential to support folks with IDD to have choice and control in their lives. And for LGBTQ plus people specifically, they can use supported decision making to have a lot of barriers that LGBTQ plus people with IDD face are related to guardians who, are preventing them from buying the clothes they want to wear or preventing them from accessing gender transition. So alternatives to guardianship, like supported decision making, and the research there is also really is really meaningful and important, I think.
Yeah, that all sounds really like amazing work that I think is going to just hopefully further this conversation on a broad scale and add to your specific conversation. Thank you, Oscar. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.